Welcome to my 245th video on my work with OO gauge. This video will be about a Hornby Dublo Duchess of Atholl model that I picked up recently at the train show in Woodstock, Ontario, not far from where I live. This is my 5th three-railed Duchess, and I'm intending it to be my last, as with this one renamed to the Duchess of Abercorn, I will now have all 5 members of the class that went into service without streamlining in 1938. This model turned out to be a little unusual in that it used the early Horseshoe type of magnet for its motor, the first time I've had occasion to service a motor of this type. More on that shortly. Here's the model as I brought it back from the Woodstock show. I didn't actually pay $120 for it. I offered $100 and my offer was accepted. I wasn't actively looking for another Duchess, but since it was right in front of me at a reasonable price, I thought that I might as well. I got the model onto my 3-rail test track. It did run backwards and forwards, but seemed to need quite a lot of power to get it moving. Next, I did an initial running trial on my Hornby Dublo 3-rail tabletop. So, just a little initial track running test of this last Duchess that I picked up at the recent Woodstock train show. It did run, with a slight push to get it started at first on the test track. Let's see what it does on this track. Not a tremendous amount fast, but at least it goes. That's 90% power, mind you, on the gauge master controller. And it's not exactly flying, but it's going. I don't know whether you can see. Let's see if we can see down the back there. There does seem to be some sparking where the back centre rail pickup is. I don't know. That's maybe the centre rail pickup's not pressing very well down on the centre rail, so we're getting sparks jumping across. I don't know whether you can really see that on the camera, but otherwise, so it sort of goes, but not too thrilling. How does it? Let's see if we can make it go backwards. If anything, it actually goes backwards a little bit better than it goes forwards. Don't know why that would be. Yes, it's a bit odd. It seems to actually go faster backwards than forwards. Oh well, so I mean it runs. It's for something that old that probably hasn't been serviced all that recently. That's not bad at all. I got the model back onto the bench to service it. I started by cleaning the wheels of the tender. Then I cleaned the wheels of the loco, first with a Pico-powered brush. Then I used a bronze brush in a rotary tool on both loco and tender wheels. The body of these early Dublo Coronation class locos is held onto the chassis by a single screw at the front, which has a square head that fits into a recess in front of the smoke box. On the other end of that screw is a nut. I suspect this wasn't the original nut, but it seemed to fit fine. I undid that nut and put it aside. This allowed me to separate the body and chassis by pulling the chassis away from the body at the front and then unhooking the slots that engaged with the body at the rear. I was surprised to find that the chassis of this model was fitted with a horseshoe type magnet. Here's a closer view of the motor with the horseshoe magnet. Magnets of this type were used on early Dublo locos. The N2s and A4s made before the war had magnets of this type. When production of Dublo models resumed around 1947, the first Duchess models that reached the market in 1948 were fitted with magnets of this type. However, by 1949, this type of magnet was phased out, replaced with the box-shaped Alnico magnets with separate side pieces. So the vast majority of Duchess of Atholl models found have the later type of magnet, and of course all later Dublo versions of the Coronation class, such as the BR Duchess of Montrose, were fitted with a later type of magnet. The horseshoe magnets present a number of issues. They're much weaker than the Alnico magnets, and it can be a problem getting them positioned so that they're close to the armature but not touching it at all. These magnets are held in place by a kind of metal yoke over the top, held down with 2 screws. I checked Ronald Dodd's video on dealing with this type of magnet. He doesn't recommend removing these magnets unless absolutely necessary, but I really wanted to disassemble this motor as it was dirty and not running very well. So I undid the screws on the yoke holding the magnet down. They were pretty long screws. Even with those screws removed, the yoke didn't readily come off. But I was able to remove it, putting it and the screws aside. There were some pieces of some kind of black sheet material between the magnet and the chassis. I was quite puzzled by these. I tried to check what pictures and videos I could find of motors with this type of magnet to see if these pieces between the magnet and the chassis were standard. I couldn't see any clear sign of them in any of the online pictures and videos, but there wasn't a lot, and much of it wasn't very clear, so I didn't really have a firm answer. I removed the brush retainers. These were shaped a little differently to the retainers on my later Dublo vertical motors. With the brush retainers removed, I used tweezers to take out the brush springs. The brushes themselves didn't want to come out. As you may see from this picture, the brushes and the commutator were really filthy. At this point I decided to remove the rear pony truck as it just kept flopping around and getting in the way. With that screw removed, the pony truck came off. That same shouldered screw also retained the drawbar as seen here. I also undid the screw holding on the front bogie, and took off bogie and screw and put them aside. The screw holding the front bogie on didn't screw into the chassis itself, rather it went right through the chassis and screwed into a nut on the other side. When putting the bogie back on, that nut needs to be located between the 2 ridges which stop it turning. The magnet had not shown the slightest sign of moving even after I removed the yoke holding it down, but now I really wanted to remove the magnet so that I could get the armature out. Ronald Dodd suggests perhaps spreading the ends of the magnet beside the commutator, but that seemed a bit risky. I just gently levered the magnet up at back and centre, starting with a very thin screwdriver and then using a larger one once there was room. The fit was very tight, and quite a bit of levering was required to shift the magnet. With patience and persistence, I did manage to remove the magnet, and the sheet pieces between the magnet and the chassis then came off. I wasn't sure what those pieces were made of. I thought that they might be metal, but magnets weren't attracted to them. I think they were just some kind of paper. I also rather think that they weren't original. I think they'd been inserted by someone to spread the sides of the magnet out a bit to provide greater clearance for the armature. I undid the top bearing of the motor with a small screwdriver. With that top bearing removed, it should be possible to take out the armature. It will only come out on one side, where there's a small cutout in the top of the chassis to allow the top of the armature to pass through. There is a nut that is there to lock the top bearing in place. You can see that here on top of the armature. I don't believe it was properly locked in place when I got this model. Here are the top bearing and its lock nut after removal, and the back of the magnet. I used the tip of a toothpick to remove carbon residue, etc. from the grooves of the commutator. There was more guck in the grooves in this case than I had ever seen. I recently managed to acquire some T-Cut Original Colour Restorer. This is a British product sold to restore the finish on motor vehicles. It isn't regularly sold in Canada where I live, but I went out of my way to order some, as OO Bill seems to swear by it for tasks such as cleaning commutators. Here are the instructions on the back of the T-Cut. Of course, those are geared to using it on car paint, which is what it's really made for. I used T-Cut on cotton buds to clean the commutator. I will say that it seemed to do a very good job, but I had to go through a couple of cotton buds with this commutator as it was really filthy. It came up really nice and shiny after cleaning with the T-Cut. I oiled all of the pivot points on the motion and the axles. I pushed out the brushes with a toothpick. The brushes were still serviceable, although they were quite worn, so I think this model had seen quite a bit of running. I got out electrical contact cleaner and a pipe cleaner. I used the pipe cleaner with contact cleaner to clean out the brush tubes. The tubes had quite a bit of dirt in them, but the pipe cleaner soon got that out. I put some molly grease onto the drive gear. I got the brushes into some contact cleaner in a shot glass to clean them off thoroughly. The dirt was quite stubborn and didn't really come off just with soaking, so I used contact cleaner on a cotton bud to scrub the brushes clean. It's hard to tell if there is a ball in the bottom bearing of these motors, and even harder to get the ball out. I've found that the best way is just to get strong magnets down onto the bottom bearing. If there's a ball in there, it should come out, and in this case it did. As seen here, you can see the ball stuck to the top of those magnets there. To put the ball back into the bottom bearing, I stuck it onto the end of a cotton bud with a dab of molly grease, which I wanted on the ball anyway. Like that, I was able to pop the ball back into the bottom bearing. The top bearing did also have a ball in it. I cleaned it and reinserted the ball with some grease. I refitted the armature and screwed the top bearing back in. The locking nut must be on top of the commutator, and then it needs to be worked back onto the thread of the bearing. The bearing is screwed down all the way until it stops on the armature and then backed off about half a turn, at least that's how I do it, and locked in place by tightening the nut up against the chassis with needle nose pliers. Next, I refitted the magnet. I did not refit the paper side pieces. I was able to fit the magnet in such a way that the armature could turn freely without touching the magnet at all. The ends of the magnet were now much closer to the armature than they had been before because it wasn't spread so much, but I felt that was probably a good thing so long as there was no touching. I refitted the retaining yoke over the top of the magnet and tightened it down, checking repeatedly that the armature still turned freely. Next, I reinserted the brushes into their tubes and refitted the brush retainers. As I say, I left these paper side pieces out. I checked the polarity of the magnet with a compass. North was on the right side, which was marked with a red dot, not by me. Ronald Dodds, the maker of the remagnetizer seen here, specifically recommends a special procedure for these horseshoe magnets. Since they tend to be weak, he recommends zapping them with the magnetizer at 3 positions. First at the back end, then at the center, then for a final burst of about 5 seconds at the wide end by the armature. With that done, I tried my chassis back on the tracks, initially without its bogie and pony truck. When I first tried it, I was somewhat alarmed to find that it wouldn't run at all. I took the chassis back to the bench and tried it with my bench power supply. It worked fine like that, so I really have no idea why it didn't run on the tracks the first time I tried it. I got it back onto the tracks where it did now run. Well, I'm damned if I know why this wouldn't run on the track the first time I tried it after the service, but it's running now. I took it back, it ran on the bench fine, so then I brought it back and now it's running on the track, and that's running at 60%. Of course it doesn't have the body on. Oh, and it's slowing down a bit now. But I was using 90% before, so hopefully maybe the service has actually done some good. I'm not even holding the controller because I put it down to open the camera, but let's try it in reverse. And of course it doesn't have its body on it. Ooh, but yes, it definitely goes considerably faster now it's serviced than it was going before, because it took 90% to go before. I'm a little bit worried about that horseshoe magnet, but I'm pretty sure the armature is able to turn freely. That's 55%, that's not bad. Okay, so at least the motor still runs, and the chassis seems to actually run better after the servicing than it did before. I took the chassis back to the bench and refitted the bogie and the pony truck. I tried it again on the tracks like that. Okay, now that chassis's got its front bogie and its rear pony truck back on, and it's running now, that's 70% on the Gauge Master controller, and that's not too bad. So I think, famous last word. I don't have the controller in my hand to put it down to here. Turn it down a little bit. That's 65. Makes quite a difference. Does go a little slower with the pony truck and the bogie on than it did without them. Oh, I'm getting clocks chiming now. Okay. Well, I reckon that will more or less do now. That's not running too badly. I'm trying to turn my attention back to the body now. Next, I wanted to remark the model. As mentioned, this is my 5th Duchess. The first members of the Coronation class that were built in the 1930s went into service with streamlining. In 1938, 5 members of the class were built and put into service without streamlining. Those 5 were all named for duchesses: the Duchess of Buccleuch, the Duchess of Atholl, the Duchess of Montrose, the Duchess of Sutherland, and the Duchess of Abercorn. I have been progressively renaming the Dublo Duchess models that I have obtained to represent those 5 locos, so this one was destined to be renamed for the last of the 5, the Duchess of Abercorn. I started by trying to remove the running numbers on the sides of the cab using methyl hydrate on cotton buds. Quite often this will remove painted markings without removing the underlying paint. Unfortunately, not in this case. For some reason I couldn't get the numbers off without also removing the crimson paint right down to the metal. That was true on both sides. I only removed the last digit, the 1, as I was running out of Pressfix gold digits, and I wasn't very confident about using the Fox waterslide transfers that I recently bought. I painted over where the crimson paint had come off using Model Master British Crimson enamel, into which I've mixed a little black to better match it with the Dublo Crimson. I had bought plates from Fox Transfers for this model. These are the early style Coronation class plates in steel, and to use them with the Dublo Duchess of Atholl it is necessary to request the special larger version for early Hornby models, as marked here. First, I separated the number plate for the smokebox door. That can be cut off with snippers, as it only has 2 thin attachment points. Here's the front of the loco as it came. The original number was painted on rather too high, with the digits going off the top of the cast plate position. So I scraped off the white paint at first along the top with the point of a sharp knife. Then I glued the Fox plate in place with a small amount of CA glue applied with the tip of a toothpick. Getting the main steel nameplates out of their frame is very difficult, or at least I find it so. I've never found any way to cut through the attachment points with any kind of knife, since they're steel and so hard, so I resort to a cutting disc in a rotary tool. I start by cutting through the top and bottom of the frame near one end. Then I score through the attachment points as best as I can with a knife, and then bend back and forth with pliers until the end of the frame snaps off. Then I do the same thing at the other end of the frame. Finally, I do my best to score through the remaining attachment points with a knife, working on a steel ruler to hold the plates flat so that I can apply pressure without bending them. And I bend those attachments back and forth until they snap. I do try to clean up the remaining stubs of the attachment points with a file, but this is very tricky to do without risking damaging the plates. This was about the best that I could do in the way of preparing the nameplates. Here's one side of the loco body with the original marking. I applied CA glue with the tip of a toothpick and stuck the Fox plate in place. Here's the original marking on the other side of the loco body. And now with the Fox plate glued on. That was it for fitting the Fox plates, but I still needed to complete the running numbers on the cab sides. I had bought Fox transfers for the various LMS loco, coach and wagon markings, including the gold markings appropriate for this loco. I was a bit nervous about using these, as my first attempt with the crew straw transfers hadn't worked at all. The transfers just came apart as I tried to apply them. I had used microset in that case, as I normally do with waterslide transfers, but I think the Fox transfers are too delicate, and the softening produced by the microset weakens them too much. I applied a piece of masking tape and used pencil and dividers to mark where I wanted the new digit. I was able to apply a Fox transfer for the digit like this. Working with just plain water, the Fox transfer positioned okay. I did the same on the other side. The match wasn't perfect, but I didn't think that it was too bad. I reconnected the body and the chassis, refitting the nut to the front screw. You can see that there's a curved slot in the front of the chassis. Normally there would be a piece on the top of the front bogie that would fit into that slot, controlling the movement of the bogie so that it could pivot from side to side, but couldn't drop down or flop about too much. However, the bogie that came with this model didn't have that top piece, so it really did flop all over the place, and there wasn't anything I could really do about that. Here's the model on the bench after reassembly. I got the model back onto the tracks for a final running test. Well, I've got this Duchess of Abercorn running, sort of, with a couple of coaches, and they're actually modern coaches. I think they're mainline. I've got a simplex coupling on the front of one of them, basically because he's not much of a puller and I don't want to strain him, and these things roll a bit more freely than the old coaches, and he's barely... Well, I'm running him off the MRC controller now, not off the Gauge Master, because he can barely run with the Gauge Master and pull anything. He's only at about 45% power on the MRC, but definitely not much of a puller. I wonder if I should try the trick that some people, including Ronald Dodds, recommend of putting little rare earth magnets on the front of the horseshoe magnet to give it some extra magnetism, because they're a bit weak, these horseshoe magnets. I wonder, should I try that? I don't know. I mean, he doesn't look as if he's running badly now, but as I say, this is on a... I'm going to try and stop him now if I can. Famous last words, I need to stop him where I can see him, preferably. Oh well, there you go, such as it is. I mean, it's sort of running, but as I say, I wonder whether I shouldn't do something more about the magnet. Like, you know, they say you could take a couple of little rare earth magnets and just put them on the sort of front of the horseshoe to add a bit of extra magnetism.